The Railroad and the Rose by Oliver Hale. The Winchester rifle's crack split the morning air, just as Catherine Thornfield stepped down from the stagecoach, her traveling dress already gathering the fine Colorado grit that seemed to coat everything in Cedar Falls. She dropped her valise with an undignified thump, her gloved hands flying to her throat as a second shot rang out from the direction of the railroad construction site. "Miss, you'd best step inside the general store," called out the stagecoach driver, his weathered face creased with concern. "That'll be the railroad boys having another disagreement with the cattle ranchers about right-of-way." Catherine straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin in the manner that had intimidated countless students back in her Boston classroom. "Nonsense. A bit of frontier bluster shall not send me scurrying like a frightened mouse." She retrieved her valise with as much dignity as she could muster, though her hands trembled slightly. "I am expected at the schoolhouse." What she had not expected was to find herself face to face with the source of the gunfire not 10 minutes later. A tall man with coal-black hair and shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway stood arguing with 3 other men outside what appeared to be Cedar Falls' excuse for a bank. His sleeves were rolled up despite the morning chill, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The railroad has legal right to that land, Morrison," he was saying, his tone as steady as his aim had apparently been moments before. "Your cattle can graze elsewhere." "Like hell they can, Garrett," snarled the older man Catherine presumed was Morrison. "My family's been running cattle through that valley since before there was talk of any damned railroad." Catherine found herself inexplicably drawn closer, her practical nature warring with her curiosity. She had always prided herself on being a sensible woman, not given to flights of fancy or romantic notions about rugged frontier men. Yet something about the way this Garrett fellow held himself, confident but not arrogant, firm but not cruel, made her linger when propriety demanded she continue on her way. "The matter is settled," Garrett said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "The Denver and Rio Grande has invested too much in this route to be deterred by a few head of cattle." Morrison spat into the street, his companions flanking him with obvious hostile intent. "This ain't over, railroad man." "No," Garrett agreed quietly, "I don't suppose it is." It was then that his gaze fell upon Catherine, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and intense, and they seemed to see right through her carefully constructed composure. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a courtesy that surprised her, "you shouldn't be standing about. These streets aren't always safe for ladies." Catherine bristled at the presumption, her spine stiffening. "I am perfectly capable of looking after myself. Thank you very much. I have been teaching in Boston for the past 6 years, and I assure you I have encountered far more dangerous situations than a few cowboys with loud voices." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his stern features entirely. "Boston, you say? Then you must be the new schoolmarm we've been expecting." "Miss Catherine Thornfield," she replied, extending her gloved hand with the proper formality her mother had drilled into her. "And you are the railroad gentleman causing all the commotion, I presume?" "James Garrett, Assistant Superintendent for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused through her glove. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Miss Thornfield. I hope you'll find our little town to your liking." "I'm sure I shall manage," she said, though privately she wondered what madness had possessed her to leave the comfort and civilization of Boston for this rough-hewn frontier settlement. The answer to that question revealed itself over the following weeks as Catherine threw herself into the task of establishing a proper school in what had previously served as the town's grain storage shed. She scrubbed floors, whitewashed walls, and fashioned desks from rough planks and sawhorses, all while maintaining the deportment expected of a lady of breeding. It was during one of these afternoon cleaning sessions that James Garrett appeared in her doorway, hat in hand and an expression of genuine concern on his face. "Miss Thornfield, I couldn't help but notice you've been working alone. Surely the town council could provide some assistance." Catherine paused in her scrubbing, wiping a stray curl from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "The town council, Mr. Garrett, consists of 3 men who seem to believe that providing a building, and I use that term generously, is the extent of their educational obligations." "That's unconscionable," he said, stepping into the room and surveying her work with obvious admiration. "You've transformed this place entirely." She felt a warm glow of pride at his praise, though she tried to hide it. Education is the foundation of civilization, Mr. Garrett. If we are to build a proper community here, we must begin with the children. You speak like someone with considerable experience in such matters. I taught at the Beacon Hill Academy for Young Ladies, she said, returning to her task with perhaps more vigor than necessary. It was considered one of Boston's finest institutions. Then what brought you to Colorado Territory? His question was gentle, but Catherine felt her defenses rise nonetheless. Sometimes a change of scenery is beneficial, she replied stiffly. James was quiet for a moment, and when she glanced up, she found him watching her with those penetrating gray eyes. I suspect there's more to the story than that. There was indeed more to the story. Far more than she was prepared to share with a man she barely knew, no matter how kind his manner, or how her pulse quickened when he looked at her that way. The scandal that had driven her from Boston was not something she discussed, not even with herself in the quiet moments before sleep. Perhaps, she said carefully, but it is not a story I care to tell. Fair enough, he said, though she sensed his curiosity was far from satisfied. Would you allow me to help with the schoolhouse? I have some carpentry skills, and I suspect you could use a proper blackboard. Catherine wanted to refuse accepting help from a man, particularly this man who seemed to see too much and affect her too deeply, went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed, but practicality won out over pride. That would be most appreciated, she said finally. Over the next several days, James appeared each evening after his work at the railroad construction site, his sleeves rolled up and his hands already reaching for hammer and nails before she could protest that she hadn't expected him to begin immediately. He built her a proper blackboard, constructed shelves for books that had yet to arrive from Denver, and even fashioned a small desk that would serve as her own. They worked together in comfortable silence much of the time, but gradually conversation began to flow as naturally as water seeking its course. Catherine learned that James had studied engineering at Harvard before the war, that he had served as a lieutenant in the Union Army, and that he believed passionately in the power of railroads to unite and civilize the vast American continent. You speak of the railroad as though it were a living thing, she observed one evening as they shared a simple supper she had prepared on the small stove he had installed in the corner of the schoolroom. In a way it is, he replied, his eyes growing distant. It breathes life into dead places, connects isolated communities, brings progress and opportunity where none existed before, and displaces people like Mr. Morrison in the process. James was quiet for a long moment, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Progress always requires sacrifice, he said finally. The question is whether the greater good is served. A utilitarian philosophy, Catherine observed. Jeremy Bentham would approve. You're familiar with Bentham's work? James asked, his surprise evident. I may be a frontier schoolmarm now, Mr. Garrett, but I was educated at Vassar College before I took up teaching. Of course you were, he said, and she thought she detected a note of admiration in his voice. I should have known. You have the bearing of a woman accustomed to intellectual discourse. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment. In Boston, her education had been seen as an impediment to matrimonial prospects. Here, in this rough frontier town, it seemed to be valued, at least by this particular man. Tell me about Boston, he said, leaning back in his chair. What did you love most about it? The symphony, she answered without hesitation. Every Friday evening, I would attend the Boston Symphony Orchestra. There is something about music that transcends the mundane concerns of daily life, don't you think? I wouldn't know, James admitted. My cultural education was somewhat neglected in favor of mathematics and engineering. That's a pity, Catherine said, then found herself adding impulsively, perhaps I could play for you sometime. There's an old piano at the church that might be coaxed into tune. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. What was she thinking, offering such intimate entertainment to a man she barely knew? But James's face lit up with such genuine pleasure that her embarrassment faded. I would like that very much, he said softly. It was then that Catherine realized how dangerous her situation had become. Somewhere between scrubbing floors and sharing philosophical discussions, she had begun to care for James Garrett in a way that went far beyond mere gratitude for his assistance. The realization terrified her. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Morrison and his men had torn up a section of railroad track during the night, and there were rumors of more serious sabotage planned. You can't be serious about riding out there alone, Catherine said when James appeared at the schoolhouse to explain why he wouldn't be able to continue his work that evening. "I'm the assistant superintendent," he replied, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "It's my responsibility to assess the damage and ensure the safety of our workers." "Your responsibility is to stay alive," Catherine said with more vehemence than she had intended. "What good will you be to the railroad if you're shot down by angry ranchers?" James stopped his preparations and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Catherine," he said, and she noticed it was the first time he had used her given name, "are you concerned for my welfare?" She wanted to deny it, to maintain the careful distance she had tried so hard to preserve, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself saying, "Yes, I am concerned. Very much so." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her hands in his. "Catherine, Whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the arrival of the sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Walsh, who looked as though he had seen too much violence in his lifetime. "Garrett, we need to ride out now," Walsh said urgently. "Morrison's gotten some of the other ranchers worked up. Word is they're planning to dynamite the bridge over Willow Creek." James released Catherine's hands with obvious reluctance. "I have to go," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "When I return." "When you return," she interrupted, "we'll discuss whatever it is you feel needs discussing." He smiled at that, a quick flash of warmth that made her knees weak. "Is that a promise, Miss Thornfield?" "It is indeed, Mr. Garrett." Catherine spent the longest day of her life watching the clock and listening for gunshots. When evening came without word, she found herself pacing the small confines of the schoolhouse like a caged animal. It was well past midnight when she finally heard the sound of approaching horses. She rushed to the window and saw James dismounting in front of the sheriff's office, apparently unharmed but moving with the wariness of a man who had seen too much in one day. Without stopping to consider the propriety of her actions, she grabbed her shawl and hurried across the street. "James," she called softly, not wanting to wake the entire town. He turned at the sound of her voice, his face transforming with surprise and something deeper. "Catherine, what are you doing out at this hour?" "Waiting for you to return safely," she said, suddenly self-conscious about her impulsive behavior. They stood looking at each other in the pale moonlight, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy between them. Finally James stepped closer, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek with infinite tenderness. "I've been thinking about you all day," he said quietly. "Even when bullets were flying and bridges were burning, you were in my thoughts." "James," she whispered, but he placed a gentle finger against her lips. "Let me say this, Catherine, because I may not have the courage again. I know we've known each other only a few weeks, and I know you're a lady of education and refinement, while I'm just a railroad man with rough hands and modest prospects. But I've come to care for you more than I thought possible." Catherine's resolve crumbled entirely. "Oh, James, I care for you too. More than is wise, more than is proper, and certainly more than I ever intended." "Then why do I sense you pulling away from me?" She looked down at her hands, gathering courage for a confession she had never made to another soul. "Because I am not the woman you think I am. In Boston there was a scandal. I became involved with a married man, a member of the school's board of trustees. When his wife discovered our association, I was dismissed in disgrace. I came west not seeking adventure, but fleeing shame." James was quiet for so long that Catherine began to fear she had destroyed whatever feelings he had harbored for her. When she finally looked up, however, she found him watching her with the same tender expression he had worn before. "Do you think that changes how I feel about you?" he asked gently. "It should," she whispered. "Any decent man would." "Any decent man would recognize that the woman standing before him is kind, intelligent, brave, and beautiful," he interrupted. "Whatever happened in your past, Catherine, it doesn't define who you are now." "But the scandal." "There is no scandal here," he said firmly. "There is only a remarkable woman who left everything familiar to build something new in an untamed land. That takes courage of the highest order." Catherine felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by his acceptance and understanding. "I don't deserve your good opinion." "That's not for you to decide," James said, tilting her chin up so she was forced to meet his eyes. "Catherine Thornfield, I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to be mine." "James," she breathed, and suddenly his arms were around her and his lips were on hers in a kiss that was gentle and fierce, and everything she had never dared hope for. When they finally broke apart, Catherine rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his pulse. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "we build a life together. The railroad will reach Denver within 2 years, and there will be opportunities for advancement. We could have a house with a proper garden, and you could continue teaching if you wished. And if I didn't wish to teach? Then you could write, or paint, or raise children, or do whatever makes you happy," he said simply. "All I want is to share whatever life you choose to build." Catherine pulled back to look at him, seeing in his storm-gray eyes a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. "Are you proposing to me, Mr. Garrett?" "I suppose I am, Miss Thornfield. Rather badly, I'm afraid, standing in the middle of the street at 1 o'clock in the morning." "On the contrary," she said, standing on her tiptoes to brush a kiss across his lips, "I believe it was perfect." 3 months later, as Catherine walked down the aisle of Cedar Falls Little Church in a dress of blue silk that had been her mother's, she reflected on the curious turns life could take. She had come west running from her past, only to find a future more wonderful than anything she had dared dream. James stood waiting for her at the altar, handsome in his best suit with his hair tamed for once and his eyes full of love and promises. Behind him, through the church's single stained glass window, she could see the railroad tracks stretching toward the mountains, carrying dreams and ambitions toward an uncertain but hopeful future. As she placed her hand in his and they spoke their vows before God and the assembled townspeople of Cedar Falls, Catherine knew that she had found more than love. She had found home, not in a place but in the heart of the man who had seen past her shame to the woman she truly was. The railroad might tame the wilderness and connect distant cities, but it was love that had truly transformed them both, carrying them from solitude to partnership, from past regrets to future possibilities. As they kissed to seal their union, Catherine heard the distant whistle of the afternoon train and smiled against her husband's lips. Some journeys, she thought, were worth every mile traveled to reach their destination.